Hello, John Fisher. Good to be with you again. Sorry there was no video last week. I was on retreat, which is something which a lot of priests do once a year, to go away on silent retreat, to have time to pray, really, recharge the spiritual batteries. So that's what I was doing last week. So sorry there was no video. Today we've got slightly different presentation. So this is presentation on St. John Paul II, who I'm sure many of you will have heard of. So he was not somebody who died young, as we've had in previous sessions. So that's good, a nice change, I think. So John Paul II, St. John Paul II. See if I can get this. So John Paul II had a difficult start in life, to be honest, for his family. He was born in 1920, it's about 100 years ago. His parents had already suffered the loss of his sister Olga dying before he was born. She survived less than a day. So already they had that loss. And then John Paul II was born in 1920, and then when he was 9 years old, his mother died. Fortunately, his mother Amelia died. So he had to cope with that. Then 3 years later, when he was 12 years old, he lost his older brother, Edmund, who was a doctor, and died aged 26. So he had a rough start to life. And he was just left with his dad, called Carol. And they were very, very close. And Carol was really a great dad to John Paul II and loved him very much. They had a great relationship. I've got this picture here showing people playing football. John Paul II was always known as being very good at sports. A nice little story is that when he was at school, they used to form sports teams based on religious beliefs, usually in the playground. So it would be usually the Jews playing the Catholics. But what John Paul II used to do, because he was a very good footballer, and the Catholics always used to win in his school, he would go over to the other side and play with the Jewish boys in his school, so that they had a chance of winning. So already he had that sort of open heart, which we'll see at play later in his life. Later on, when he goes to university, life continues to be quite difficult. So in 1938, he goes to university to study drama and Polish. And then those of you who studied a bit of history, you'll know 1939, Second World War breaks out. So his university closes, and obviously the war comes with all its atrocities. 2 years later, 1941, his dad dies. So if you remember, his dad was the only member of his family left, and he dies while John Paul II is sort of imprisoned working in a quarry. John Paul II gets sent to a quarry to work for the German occupiers in Poland. So he's not able to be with his dad. It's very, very difficult. Then in 1944, when John Paul II was in Poland, so he grew up in Poland, he had a serious injury. He was actually hit by one of the German army trucks and almost died. But thankfully he survived and managed to get through the Second World War. In the midst of all of that, he discovers his vocation to become a priest, and secretly starts his studies for the priesthood in 1942. So this is in the midst of the Second World War. He's working in a quarry as a prisoner. And then secretly at night, he will take a little candlelight and start to study what books of theology he can. And he was known for being a very bright person, very intellectually capable. And so very quickly, he's able to complete his studies of the priesthood, despite the horrors of the Second World War. And he's ordained a priest shortly afterwards in 1946. As a priest, he does a lot of work with young people. And this picture, which you see here, is John Paul II on one of his canoeing trips, where he would take a group of university students to do hikes and different activities. And he'd often teach them how to pray and teach them about various things. So John Paul II, work with young people. In 1958, he becomes the youngest ever Polish bishop. And then, as I'm sure many of you know, he then becomes a pope in 1978, elected Pope by a unanimous decision of the cardinals. And as a Pope, he continued to do a lot of work for young people, and he started what's now called the World Youth Days. The first one he started in Rome in 1985. And basically they just got bigger and bigger, attracted bigger crowds. So he then continued, had one in Buenos Aires in Argentina, 87, Santiago de Compostela, that's in Spain, Czestochowa, that's in Poland, Denver in America, Manila in the Philippines, Paris in France, and Toronto in Canada. So he starts these World Youth Day gatherings of young people from all over the world, and literally millions would come together, and they were always known as great events, and they still continue. Of course, the next one's in Portugal. In his time as Pope, he did a huge amount of traveling. So it's estimated he traveled to 129 different countries. He covered, in total, during his time as Pope, 75,000 miles, which they say is the equivalent of going to the moon 3 times. So a huge amount of traveling. And it is thought that John Paul II is the person in history who has met the most number of people. So because in these gatherings, he literally was there in front of millions. You can see here is a time that he visited my mum's country, Colombia, and just literally thousands of people would come to see him. So it's thought that he's the person who's met the most number of people ever in the world. Just to finish, one of the important events of his life, could say so much about John Paul II, but was the famous assassination attempt in 1981. So John Paul II was in St. Peter's Square in Rome, and out of nowhere, a shot gets fired, and suddenly they see him falling to the ground. It's then thought that he lost about 3/4 of his blood, and he had to immediately go to hospital. He was operated on for 5 hours. Thankfully, he survived. And the wonderful thing about this story is the person who shot him, who was somebody from Turkey, who actually straight away, once the shot was fired, a nun nearby saw him with the gun and actually sort of restrained him and tackled him. That's a great action by the nun there. But 2 years later, once he was better, he was actually able to go and visit his the person who attempted to shoot him in prison, and he said he forgave him, completely from the heart, and they had a very good conversation and sort of ended up sort of becoming friends as much as possible. So wonderful example of forgiveness from John Paul II. And immediately after he was shot, he just said, I forgive him. He actually, less than a year later, another assassination attempt was made in Spain. Somebody tried to stab him and he only got minor injuries, thankfully. And then later on, I think in 1995, there was another assassination attempt. Somebody tried to do a suicide bomb against him, but thankfully that was thwarted. So John Paul II, very dramatic life, you could say. And he's known for doing many, many other things, but I just wanted to share those particular highlights. And in 2014, he was declared a saint in the Catholic Church. And I had the great privilege, because I was studying in Rome at that time, of being there for his canonization. I wasn't in the square, however, because there were over 1 million people there. So I was actually about half a mile back in this huge crowd, because the people who were there in the square had been camping overnight, which I wasn't quite prepared to do. But I was able to be there, which was great. And just finish with one of my favorite quotations from John Paul II. He said, "We are not the sum of our weaknesses and failures. We are the sum of the Father's love for us and our real capacity to become the image of his Son, Jesus Christ." So John Paul II always used to tell young people, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. God loves you so much, and you are his daughter and his son, and rejoice in that. So that's John Paul II. I hope you, if you're not familiar with him already, feel free to read more about his story. Very, very fascinating and inspirational person. So hope you have a good weekend and hopefully see you next week. God bless.